So who's got some of Grossman with the road, the Kublik essays in the road? I doubt you printed out the Ukraine without Jews, but I trust you read it online. But I'm going to have a kind of detailed conversation about Grossman today. And I'll kick it off, but then I'm going to ask for your thoughts, reflections, ideas about the material that you've read. In some ways, I'd say the sitting is actually a better way to be in a seminar situation with you. We're on the same eye level. It's better. It's good. And there's a gratifying number of eyes in the room. It's good. In some ways, to me, this is the most powerful set of readings that you have done and will do. And it's partly literature. It's partly first-person reportage and observation. It's partly the descriptions of a person who was, a person who was an active participant. He was attached to the Red Army. He traveled to the most dangerous parts of combat with the Red Army. It's a miracle that he survived the war. It's also a miracle that he survived Stalin, because he was not cautious. Well, maybe he was a little cautious, but he wasn't super cautious. He wasn't extremely cautious. He wasn't a hack writer in the Soviet period, at a time when writers were being shot by the hundreds for not showing sufficient loyalty, sufficient fealty to Stalin. So he's an amazing witness. Even his face appeals to me. I think I can find a picture kind of quickly of his face. Why would that matter? Is that kind of a stupid comment to make? Does it matter if a person's face seems like a decent person? That's Grossman. Do you know where that is? Any idea where that is? It's a very historic moment because it's in Berlin when the Red Army has retaken the German capital. It is the end, well, virtually the end of the war in Europe. And Grossman was with the Red Army. Have you ever seen the amazingly famous photograph of the Red Army soldier on the roof of, I think it's the Reichstag? Oh, yes. You've seen that? I wonder if anybody could find it quickly. I bet you could, just by Googling soldier, Reichstag, Red Army, Berlin. It's not going to help if it's on a tiny little screen, except you could maybe, I don't know what you could do, since I don't get email on this device, because I don't pull up my email on here, but it's a famous photograph. Yeah, you're pretty resourceful. Yeah, that's it. So can you maximize it so people can see a little better? What was the search that you used to find it?
Just Soviet soldier, Reichstag watches.
Okay. I'll be able to put it up on the screen here then. Soviet soldier, Reichstag, Berlin. This is probably the I've seen the original of this photograph at an exhibition at Colgate University, and it's very interesting because it's airbrushed. The original, well, a print from the original negative, the literally original negative, because before it was airbrushed. And the airbrushing was an especially primitive process. You know what airbrushing is, right? They didn't have Photoshop in those days. In this case, it was a sensor's pin on the negative, erasing or removing an element of this photograph. The element was that the soldier up there has two watches. He's got a watch in his left hand and a watch in his right hand. What do you think that represents? It doesn't deliberately represent anything, but what do you think it signifies?
Well,
Who's saying that? Go ahead.
is he looting?
Looting, of course. He's a soldier. This is a combat soldier. But his job is not just ceremonial. He's lifting the Soviet flag on the roof of the Reichstag. But before that, he was moving through fields, he was shooting people, he was stealing from corpses, and he was putting watches on his arms. And the Soviet censors felt that was not consistent with the heroic image of the Red Army. So his second watch was removed. It's just really very, very interesting. Submit your own photo. I don't have a photo to submit. So, I mean, I have a lot of great photos, but none of this magnitude. So I'm going to take that away. So back to Vasily Grossman. This is the same week, this photograph of Vasily Grossman in Berlin, same week. And the amazing thing is that this young man, he was born in 1905, so he's roughly 38, 39, 40 years old. This must be, I guess it's 1945 that the Red Army made it to Berlin. So he's 40 years old. He's a well-known reporter, war journalist. The first time I heard his name was on NPR, and they had a little snippet of his war reporting about Kiev. This was before the Ukraine-Russian war. And I found it so intriguing. It was only a paragraph, but it was very intriguing. And I realized this is from 1941, when the Red Army is in complete defeat, racing backwards as fast as it could go. I don't know if do you read about what's happening in Ukraine now? There's just story after story of Russian troops just suddenly breaking. But there's a story in the New York Times this morning about a guy who's in his house still in eastern Ukraine, a Ukrainian man, just hoping not to be bothered. And soldiers come to his house and they say, we're requisitioning your moped. And they grab his moped and they take off on the moped and run to the east. So their retreat was not, I mean, it's kind of a comical picture, isn't it? Grabbing bicycles, grabbing mopeds, and retreating from the Ukrainian army. The Russian army was in that kind of retreat in 1941 from German troops, right up until the moment that the mud came. I bet they have a name in Russian for the mud. It's probably not a very nice name. But the mud means that armored vehicles have an enormously difficult job continuing to move forward. And then what do armored vehicles need? There's other stuff they need. Gosh, let's think about that. Gasoline. Gasoline tankers have trouble keeping up with them. In other words, the army, the German army bogged down, and the Russians finally, after losing, somebody doing starving POWs today? Yeah. So you're going to talk about the unhappy fate, the tragic fate of the people who were victim to this piece of Stalinism. I hope you're going to bring up the crazy Stalin errors that led to several million prisoners being taken in different engagements. 50,000 here, 100,000 there, and then subjected to the most brutal starvation regime. But that was partially the German army, but it was also partially Stalin. In any case, the Red Army finds its way back. In the meantime, Grossman, if I had a map of Ukraine, which I had laboriously put the route that Grossman took as the Red Army was retreating through Ukraine, through Poland, through Lithuania, through Estonia, through Belarus, he and a group of 4 or 5 reporters in an army truck. I mean, this is like, make a movie, man. This is movie material. Their truck zooming through the countryside, sometimes being behind German lines where they would immediately be shot, and sometimes then getting back on the, but how could you stay on the right side of the Russian lines when the Russian lines are retreating at 50 miles a day? It's hard to keep the truck moving even at 50 miles a day. So his experience as a war correspondent, and then he was also a war correspondent in Stalingrad and in the Battle of Stalingrad, which was first a fierce, fierce battle, which Hitler's army expected to win very quickly, which it didn't win quickly. It, in the end, failed, and its armies were disastrously defeated. That was the end of the German military force in the East, was the Battle of Stalingrad. And Grossman observed it. Interesting to know that a lot of Soviet war correspondents got their news from headquarters, safely behind the lines. Grossman felt that's not where the news is. And so he conducted interviews. It's just very moving material that he gathered while he was in Stalingrad, of interviewing women flyers, for example, who were flying missions every day, men who were getting onto tanks which were being built in Stalingrad and not rolled out to the Rotunda test ground for their land trials, but being rolled out to face the enemy, 20 minutes later. But Grossman observed all of that. He was an active observer. As I say, it's just a miracle that he survived the war. He observed the Holocaust. We now know that from the material I asked you to read. He was with the Red Army when it came to the place that had been Treblinka. And as you know now, Treblinka no longer existed when the Red Army got there. It had been destroyed and burned, and the Nazis had tried to destroy it completely. And he has some wonderful poetic and ironic things to say about the idea of concealing the deaths of what he thought were 3 million people. It seems now that it was more like 1 million people. He overestimated the number of trains that were brought to Treblinka on a daily basis. But the idea of concealing the deaths of 1 to 3 million people, he thinks is simply astounding. Astounding, yeah.
For the old teacher, was that, I didn't understand who, like, he was talking about. Was it his own experiences? Was it someone else's experiences?
It's a story, so it's fictional.
Okay.
How did other people understand the old teacher? So let's transition to the material. How do you understand? The last point I was going to make actually is he interviewed hundreds of people, and he seemed to be a gifted interviewer.
Yeah, you could see that in Treblinka's.
Because he wasn't interested in getting the quick story. He wasn't fast news. He wasn't airdrop me in, I'll talk to 3 colonels and I'll get the next jeep out. He had extensive interviews, and he sort of understood the human soul of the people he was speaking with. So many, many interviews of civilians, victims, previous guards at Treblinka, previous officers at Treblinka, survivors. I think he actually located some of those survivors in the woods before us outside of Treblinka. There was an amazingly successful uprising at Treblinka, which actually I think very few of us know about, uprisings in a death camp. I didn't think of having an uprising in a death camp, but it did occur, and 300 men and possibly some women escaped into the forest. Most of them were tracked down and killed, but I think 100 survived. So interviews, but that story, what do you think? Where do you think the content of that story, the old teacher, may have come from? Let's put it up. That was my plan for today. I have a lot of Grossman's own words. So here's the old teacher.
Was the old man also fictional?
I think they're all fictional. Yeah, the old man, the beekeeper, is, I think they're all the novelist's creation.
Treblinka was not.
No, Treblinka is real. It's a real death camp. And it's a piece of journalism. It's not a piece of fiction at all. But the old teacher and the old man, those are both fictionalized accounts of what? Just stuff he made up? Yeah, go ahead.
I imagine they're like him taking all the information from people he's interviewed and kind of putting it together in different stories to tell like one specific situation or something.
Yes, yes. So he took a lot of the personal experience of people who had lived through German occupation of the village.
So it's not really fiction.
Well, that's an interesting question. We'll come back to it. I want to get your point though. Didn't you have your hand up?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, I interpreted it as like someone's story, like he interviewed someone and they told him a story, and then he just like wrote it more dramatically.
Well, I don't even think it's possible though, because all these people died. The doctor died, the old man died, the beekeeper presumably died. He was old anyway, he was super old. So maybe not interviewing these particular individuals, but that raises your question. Is it fiction or is it, kind of documentary? What do you think about that? Where do novelists get their material? Is it just imaginary, or do they sometimes take it from their own lives or from the lives of people they've observed or experiences they've had? What do you think about that?
Like what they've seen others experience and like their own imagination.
Yeah. So they've observed a social environment. It might be a family, or it might be a village, it might be a city, it might be a group of people on the move, it might be conflict, it might be civil war. They have somehow put into their literary imagination a bunch of very vivid scenes, and then they somehow work that into a very powerful piece of kind of unified fiction, a story that in this case.
The old man does read as like a horror story outside of its context of this class.
You think a horror story?
Yeah.
Huh.
Like something that like the horror of you becoming something that you don't expect, I guess.
Well, that's interesting. So what is it that the old man became?
The person murdering that he never, like, he doesn't come off as that person in the beginning,
Right.
as that violent person, someone who's just, he starts out as someone who's just calm and living life, and then you just see him become like the monster that you would never expect him to be.
Well, is he a monster though?
Oh,
Does-
yeah,
does everybody
monster
read-
is the wrong word to use considering the context of like Treblinka and how the author uses monster in that sense. He's not the same kind of monster.
Okay, so let's maybe try to work that through. So it's Semyon Mikhaich. Old Semyon Mikhaich, the quietest man in the village. Not a drinker, not a smoker, didn't complain to his neighbors, never heard to quarrel with his old woman, that would be his wife, I assume. His voice was quiet and gentle. His movements were no less quiet and gentle. Okay, so that's the introduction to the old man. Let's go to the end of the story. It's a very short story, isn't it? Then there's the battle for the village is pretty much over. The Soviet partisans have won, but there's a German machine gunner who is with a small machine gun, not a. My father once explained to me how he learned to fire a bar, a Browning automatic rifle in the Army in World War II. And he told me something I never forgot. He said it has a 3-man crew. One to hold the gun, you have to stand up straight and hold the gun. One to feed the ammunition, and one to replace the standing man as soon as he's shot, which is within minutes, because he's standing. So it's not a very sensible design for a weapon. But anyway, my dad never actually had to fire that weapon. He learned how to use it. I don't know if he was the third guy, who's supposed to step up, but I don't know. I have no idea. Okay, so the fighting grew fierce. The pounding grew so loud that the old women wrapped shawls around the little children. And then not far away, they heard a muffled voice. "It's our boys, it's our boys," shouted Galia Yakimenko. "Who'll come with me?" "I will," said Semyon Mikhaich. Semyon refused to join the partisans earlier. He said, I can't even squash a bumblebee. No, I couldn't do that. But he says he will join them. They climb up out of the cellar. Evening was already drawing in. A vast sun was sinking into snow, made pink by by blazing fires. What else makes snow pink? That seems like a literary thing. When does snow become pink? When people bled all over it, when there's been a lot of killing. Okay, so the vast sun was sinking into the snow made pink by blazing fires. In the middle of the yard stood a Red Army soldier with a rifle. Good people, he said quietly. This is the Red Army soldier. Help me, I'm wounded. My darling boy, Galia shouted and rushed to the soldier. She embraced him and led him quickly to the hut. Semyon Nikaish just walked on. My darling, said Galia, you boys have been shedding your blood for us. Now it's our turn to do something. Soon we'll have you lying down in the warm. From somewhere near the well came the sound of shooting. A German submachine gunner came running toward the hut. He saw a wounded Red Army soldier and a woman with her arms around him. Still running, he fired a shot. The wounded soldier, suddenly heavy, began to sink to the ground, slipping out of the arms of the woman, who was still struggling to keep him upright. The German fired a second shot. Galia fell to the ground. Semyon could never remember how it was that he had come to be holding a heavy cudgel. For the first time in his life, he was in the grip of a terrible rage, a rage that was burning away the humiliations of the previous months. Those were the humiliations imposed by the Nazi troops in his village, humiliating the Jews, humiliating the villagers, treating them in a very inhuman way. A rage that he felt both on his own behalf and on behalf of others, on behalf of thousands and thousands of old men, children, young girls, women, a rage on behalf of the earth herself, abused as she had been by the enemy. He raised the cudgel high above his head and advanced on the German. Tall and majestic, with snow white curls, this old beekeeper was the living embodiment of the Great Patriotic War. You know what that is, right? The Great Patriotic War. That's the Soviet term for the Second World War. Halt, shouted the German, raising his submachine gun high into the air, but the old man smashed down his cudgel. Just then a group of Red Army soldiers appeared. Leading them was a man in a black sheepskin coat with a grenade in his hand. It was Prokofy, the chairman of the collective farm. What he saw was a terrifying picture: dead bodies lying outside a hut, a German lying beside the doorway, and brilliantly lit by the flames, the quiet beekeeper, cudgel in hand. That's what you're saying is the monstrous transformation. Is it monstrous, or what do you make of that? We open with this very peaceful old man, and we end with a piece of righteous violence and anger. But are you changing your mind?
No, I'm going to keep my stance just because I feel like he turned to violence. I see that he has no choice, but to start as someone who is refusing and then getting to the point of using violence instead of finding it differently might be something that, you know, he, like, if he's saying he could never remember how he had gotten to that point, then I feel like, you know, that's something that he wouldn't admire about himself, and yet he still felt the need to have to do. So that's what I thought of as like monstrous.
So what was it that made him so angry? Why was he angry? What had the German done that provoked this anger? He had killed a wounded man, and he had killed a woman. He had killed, in other words, the innocent. The wounded man was no longer a combatant because he was no longer able to defend himself. So he, you know, essentially killed a non-combatant man and a woman who was coming to his aid. And the old man, what? He could no longer tolerate that. I don't know, how do other people react to the story? We should find some of those passages in between. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's justified in a way, like, I mean, it's self-defense. He says halt. Usually if he's saying halt, I don't think he's gonna, I mean, he just killed two non-combatants already. Probably would have ended up shooting the, because he's holding a cudgel. So I would have guessed he would have been shot immediately.
Right.
The halt was probably just going, you know, trying to hit him. I think it's definitely a transformation. I think it's supposed to be like you kind of have to defend yourself. Like, either die or kill someone who's been killing people mercilessly.
Could there be, yeah, okay, so in kind of narrow terms, you're sort of saying, almost from the point of view of the law of war, self-defense is a justification for killing an armed combatant. So you might say, no crime. The reference to the Great Patriotic War, tall and majestic, with snow white curls, this old beekeeper was a living embodiment of the Great Patriotic War. What do you think of that?
It's definitely kind of symbolic, like it's showing this like peaceful, like hardworking farmer, which, you know, a lot of the Soviet Union, they really emphasized, you know, being a hardworking citizen of your country, like beekeeping is for the community. You know, you don't do it just to make money, you do it to make honey and keep bees and help the community and the forest. So it's definitely symbolic of like showing, giving yourself to the community that, you know, when needed, called upon to be found, to be against crimes like this.
So I kind of wonder, is this at least partly a metaphor for the aroused Soviet people have now taken the cudgel and they're defeating the Nazi. They're killing the Nazi. They will march on Berlin and they will completely destroy the Nazi army. Do you think that's maybe part of the war is not over when he writes? Actually, I'm not sure when he wrote this story. Anybody maybe just look at the oh yeah, there you go, 42.
I'm not sure if that's when he wrote it.
Or when it's supposed to have happened.
Yeah.
It seems like that's when it's supposed to have happened. Let's go up to the top and see if it says anything more about the origin of the story. Bad, went too far.
It says they were translated in 1945.
So maybe he did write it during the war.
Yeah.
It kind of seems like he wrote it during the war. Which is
I
interesting.
just pulled up the part two, like the very.
Yeah.
It's like the intro to the.
Yeah. Yeah, there's Grossman again. In a just liberated village. This is actually an interesting photograph, isn't it? Because this is the same year as the story is supposed to take place. When the story takes place, it's very clear from the military advance of the Nazis through Ukraine. By the end of 1942, they were out of Ukraine and into Russia proper. So that's pretty interesting. Any other observations people had about this super short story? It's pretty powerful, isn't it? Let's get maybe one or two other moments. The Germans had been in the village for nearly 3 months. They had occupied the village. First, the forward units had gone through. The village had been plundered. When the women went into the dark, empty sheds, they wept. All they could think about was the cows that were no longer there. Everything from their huts was vanishing. Sheepskin coats, embroidered towels, quilted jerkins, pillows and blankets. In the afternoons, the old men and women would get together and curse the Germans, reciting long lists of grievances. Semyon Mikhaich would say nothing. He just listened to all the furious words and sighed. He himself had suffered as much as anyone else at the hands of the Germans. They had ravaged his beloved hives. They had seized his stores of honey and wheat. Even the old bed on which he slept for long decades had been taken off the back of the truck by some corporal with bloodshot eyes. So complete looting of the village. What he doesn't refer to is what was also a reality of German occupation of villages, and that is rape. He doesn't refer to the sexual abuse of the women of the village, but that was a very common part of, as the current Russian occupation of Ukrainian villages and Ukrainian towns. There's just horrifyingly, sickeningly great quantity of evidence about torture, rape, and murder in villages. Over 500 corpses were discovered in one of the villages around Kherson, I think it was. Let's see, what else? The Germans misbehaving. What's kind of interesting is that the German deliberate, what do you know about partisan warfare in World War II? In Ukraine and, you know, these bloodlands that we are acquainted with from Timothy Snyder. What is a partisan resistance? What is that? Just maybe a quick explanation. Yeah.
I'm just going to guess, but isn't it like not Nazis come in and then there's a communist partisan resistance, or communists come in and it's like a Nazi partisan resistance?
Yeah, or just local people who've been able to seize arms. There were Jewish partisan units in the forest. The thing about being an invading army is forests and mountains are hard to control. So if it's possible to stay armed and then retreat to the forest, supply is the most difficult problem. As I kind of smile when I say that, but it's familiar from the history of war and conflict that if a group cannot be resupplied, whether it's with gasoline, I was talking about the tanks a little while ago, or with firewood and food and clothing and ammunition, then it's no longer a fighting force. But partisan groups were groups of fighting men and women who were armed and who were at least partially supplied by the Red Army. It was part of Stalin's plan to have his plan. He didn't exactly have great plans, but part of his intention about warfare in Ukraine was to get a partisan movement going in the forests, which would then, it couldn't directly attack major Wehrmacht units, but what could a partisan unit do? What kind of violence could a partisan unit commit? If you were, let's see, the fascists have seized Grand Rapids, but is there a forested area around Grand Rapids? You don't know either. We none of us know our Michigan geography very well. There must be forests. I'm pretty sure there are forests. So there's partisans out in the forest, and that fascist government in Grand Rapids is supplied along a railroad from Grand Rapids to Detroit, where there's a major fascist force. What can partisans do? Yeah.
Oh, they attack supply lines behind the
Yeah.
lines.
They attack the railroad, they break the railroad, they blow up bridges, they maybe attack engines, you know, steam engines or diesel engines. And as I've just been saying, disrupting supply lines is catastrophic for a mobile army. And so partisan activity can have some important military effect. The Germans were completely ruthless in their response to partisan warfare. And this is way too gentle. This is an occupation of a village, which clearly, am I right? This village is supporting a partisan unit, isn't it? It's not just friendly with it, it's kind of connected to that partisan unit. They know them all. They greet them with, "Hello, Sergei, so good to see you. Come and kill some Germans with me and defend us from these horrible people." So there's a relationship. The German orders of the day were to kill everyone in the village, burn them in barns, burn them in churches, kill them all. It was about deterrence. It was about revenge. It was horrific. It was also a war crime. But obviously the Germans were not very concerned about war crimes. So in other words, as difficult a story as this is, it's not quite as difficult as the actual reality of occupied Nazi occupied villages in Ukraine, Eastern Poland and Estonia and so forth. Does that make sense or not? Or do you think I'm overstating it? I'm not suggesting that he's sugarcoating, but he's telling a story which isn't quite as harsh as the reality. We saw right at the beginning what happened in Mirapol. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just thinking maybe he wanted to focus on how these events mentally affected
Mhm.
you.
Yes, good. Good.
Obviously, the beekeeper was heavily affected by everything going on.
Right. Right. That's good. And how about it's mostly women who have a voice in this story, aside from the beekeeper. And what is their voice? How do you read the voices of people in the village? Are they beaten? Are they, we just have to do everything the Germans tell us? Or are they showing some quiet courage? I think I'm giving away the answer that I'm expecting, but go ahead. Yeah, bye.
But yeah, they're definitely, they have hope.
Yeah, and that's a really important theme in Grossman, because he also continues to have hope. And we're going to see that. This is really good. We can grab some passages I think out of each of these texts. This is the least of the texts. It's a simple little vignette of occupation. In a sense, it's almost like a counterpart to the ravine. Also in Ukraine, probably, oh gosh, is it maybe 300 or 400 kilometers across Ukraine from Mirapol to this part of Ukraine. But on a superhighway, that's about 2 hours driving. So you might in your mind kind of have it in mind, this village and Mirapol are kind of similar locations. Okay. Anything else? Anybody else would like to comment about this story, this is the appetizer in the fancy restaurant. It's got a little bit of sadness. Well, it has a lot of sadness.
Yeah, appetizer, I don't like associating with this.
No, you're right. I'm searching for words. It's, what would you say? It's the introduction. It's merely the introduction to, it's the tip of the iceberg, even better. So how about the old teacher? There's a lot in the old teacher. It's a much longer story. Anybody have some reactions to the old teacher? Take an impression away from this. What kind of person is the old teacher? He is old. I think he's almost 80. Am I making that inference incorrectly? So in his 70s anyway. It's a very poignant story. It's kind of a heartbreaking story. Yeah.
Yeah, just with the old teacher, I was thinking he was a pretty just wise old man, pretty much. Like people kind of came to him to ask for advice and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I was thinking of his conversation with the doctor, I think. Yes. And the doctor was like kind of pleading with him, like, what if you're a mathematician philosopher, what am I supposed to, like, what are we supposed to do here? What's supposed to be happening? So just sort of like knowing that he was someone that everyone kind of like, oh, we have this really like wise sage type figure in the village to just kind of talk to.
Right. But he's also taught some amazing people who are now researchers in Kerch, and they're around Ukraine, around Russia, and in other words, he's been a man of influence. I think he was a math teacher, said.
Yeah, well, the doctor says he's a philosopher and mathematician.
Yeah. So a wise man, but not necessarily wise like Socrates, just sitting with the wisdom of gnomic sayings, like a cartoon figure, but a person who has understood some of life and who has educated a lot of people, who has strong relationships. What is the doctor's view? What does he think? They're coming. This is a grimmer story, because they're coming doesn't mean things are going to be tough for a while. What does it mean? For the Jews of this village. I don't know if we know what the name of this village is. It's fictional, I'm sure, but They know, yeah, go ahead,
Well, I just wanted to mention something else about the teachers too.
good,
There was one scene where he's sitting and looking at reading all the letters and looking at all the photographs, and he's thinking about how he wanted to be loved, like he had shown love to so many other people,
Mhm.
and stuff like that, and then I thought it was really heartbreaking how at the end, it was the little girl who ended up showing that to him.
Right.
Covering his eyes.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to read those two passages. There's the little girl, here we go. Then 6-year-old Katya. Would you like to read it? Actually, you brought up the girl. Can you read it from where you're sitting?
Yeah,
Yeah, the two paragraphs.
Then 6-year-old Katya, the daughter of Weissman, the lieutenant who had been killed, came up to him in her torn dress, shuffling along in the galoshes that were falling off the dirty, scratched little feet. Offering him a full sour pancake, she said, "Eat here." Took the pancake and began to eat it, looking at the little girl's big face. As he ate, there was a sudden hush in the yard. Everyone, the old woman, the big-breasted young woman who could no longer remember their husbands, the one-legged lieutenant, Veronica, lying on a mattress under a tree, was looking at the old man and the little girl. Rosenthal dropped his book and did not try to pick it up. He was looking at the little girl's huge eyes, which were intently, even really watching her destiny. Once again, he felt the urge to understand, a wonder that never ceased to amaze him.
Here you go.
Perhaps the answer was there in the child's eyes, but her eyes must have been too dark, or maybe what got in the way were his own tears. Once again, he saw nothing and understood them.
Okay, so that little moment of kindness from this little child, and I'm going to go all the way to the end, to the other passage that you mentioned. Some terrible things have happened in between. Did I already go? I don't think I've gone
No, it was page 98.
page 98. I don't seem to have pages in my,
I
this
think
is,
at the
here we
top.
go. Yeah, here we go. I got it. So what's happening here? Starting right here. You did such a nice job. I'd like for you to continue if you don't mind, but before you start, what is happening now? This is the ravine moment. This is the time when the Jews are being marched to the ravine and killed by gunfire. So you can read if you like.
Where do you want me to start?
I was thinking in the commotion that followed.
In the commotion that followed, little Katya Weissman lost her mother and her grandmother. She was clutching at the hem of old Rosenthal jacket. Some difficulty to pick her up. He turned his head to bring his mouth close to her ear and said, "Don't cry, don't cry." Holding on to his neck with one hand, the girl answered, "I'm not crying." It was difficult for him to keep holding her. His head was spinning, his ears were ringing, his legs were shaking from not being used to walking so far, and agonizing tension of these last hours. People were backing away from the ravine. Some were refusing to move forward. Some were falling to the ground and trying to fall back. Soon Rosenthal was close in front of the crowd. 15 men were led to the edge of the ravine. Rosenthal knew some of them. Mendel, the tactor stonemaker, Morevich, the dental technician, Appelfeld, that good-natured old road electrician. Appelfeld's son was now a teacher in the Kiev conservatory. When he was a boy, Rosenthal had taught him there. His breathing became labored, but the old man went on holding the little girl in his arms. Thinking about her was a distraction. How could I comfort her? How could I deceive her? The old man wondered, gripped by a feeling of infinite sorrow. At this last minute, too, there would be no one to support him, no one to say what he had longed all his life to hear. The words he had desired more than all of his books about the great thoughts and even the little girl turned toward him. Her face was cold. It was the pale face of an adult, a face full of tolerant compassion. And in a sudden silence, he heard the voice. "Teachers," he said, "don't look that way. It will frighten you." And like a mother, she covered his eyes with her hands.
Powerful. Really powerful. What do you make of that? I don't want to put you on the spot. You did such a nice job of reading, but what do you all make of those two passages, the pancake and the last moments of this man and girl? I'm thinking about Grossman telling the story. Is it a real story? In a sense, it certainly is a real story, not necessarily about Rosenthal and is it Katya? Is that the girl's name? Not about these particular, but mother and child, father and child, grandfather and child, completely common. So I don't know, some kind of reaction to Grossman's telling this story. Were you starting to make a comment?
Oh, I was just gonna say that. Yeah, I think like despite him, like everyone coming to him for like throughout the story, everyone's coming to him for advice, asking him what's going on. And even then he was trying to fulfill the role of the teacher, like the guardian in that moment. And just seeing how like Grossman turns the whole story to show the humanity in that, like it's not about him having to serve the role of the adult at that point. It's just two people relating to each other in that moment, and his vast wisdom compared to her experiences just by age, like that contrast is what makes this so powerful. And I guess like it just shows like the intensity of the moment.
So is there kind of the suggestion, remember the first passage that you read, it was the girl's kindness in giving the sour pancake. I don't know if pancakes are supposed to be sour. You know, it's a special delicacy in the Ukraine. It sounded a little bit off-putting, but maybe it was really great. More likely, it's that there was almost no food, and she was being super kind, like a 5-year-old who normally maybe would have eaten the pancake. She gave it to the old man. So that was a piece of kindness. And what does it mean that it's a 5-year-old, not a 25-year-old who does this? To attribute this kindness and this wisdom to a child, what do you think of that?
I took it to be like, kindness can always come from places you might not expect them to come from. You know?
Yeah,
Especially in
that's a good point.
times of extreme hardship.
Right. So in very, very horrific times, the little girl shows a kind of strength, actually, an amazing strength for any human being, let alone for a 5-year-old child. Were you going to say something?
I was getting kind of similar to that. I think maybe just represents like the strong sense of community that the village had, like even the one word, even though the little girl knew that like, she had some responsibility for this person.
Okay, so that makes it a little more general that he's one of many people. I'm kind of reading it as a much more specific. Her compassion is for him, Rosenthal, and his caring for the little girl is also for her, not just for all children, but I mean, I think he would be compassionate to all children, but it's Katya that he is specifically concerned about. How can he protect her? And then the surprise, of course, is that she tries to protect him. She tries to shield him from what's coming. I think there is meaning in this. And the meaning, I think, several of you have mentioned humanity. But I think that's a really deep part of Grossman's understanding of the world and understanding of philosophy, understanding the negation of Nazism, the negation of hatred, the negation of killing and murder and supremacy. It's humanity and recognizing the humanity in the other person. And this little girl doesn't know much. She doesn't know geometry. She can't do a theorem. but she knows something about human grace or human compassion and caring. And so does the old man. They both do, kind of. It's a very different old man, isn't it, from the other old man? How did the doctor decide to end his contest with the Nazis? Do you remember from the story? Rosenthal and I forget the doctor's name, but they had a kind of a philosophical conversation. They're coming tomorrow, and they plan to kill us all. So what shall we do? And the doctor has a plan. They can find the plan. The Nazis have a plan too, which is to kill everybody. It's a long enough story that I'm not sure I can find it easily. The doctor's plan is suicide. He and his wife will kill themselves with drugs that the doctor has. And he refers to, it's not Seneca, he refers to the Stoics. In fact, maybe I can search for Stoic. That would do it. I bet it doesn't. I'm on page 41 if I need to come back here. Yes. Yeah, this must be it. No, this is the Germans not wanting the Jews to commit suicide because they want to kill them themselves. In any case, they have this discussion. Yeah, go ahead.
Wasn't it on page 9, the teacher said, Epicurus taught that his sufferings become unbearable, the wise man can kill himself out of love of God.
That's the passage I'm thinking of, Epicurus. Am I spelling Epicurus correctly?
It's highlighted.
Yeah, it's right there.
Yeah. Okay, so, yeah, so you got it. So why don't you, do you mind reading the passage from "We're trapped now" and then down to about here?
Yeah.
Let's see, where's "We're trapped"? I lost.
It's right above.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's easy enough. Yeah, okay.
It's kind of difficult to read.
Oh, I need to undo that. Yeah, there you go. Oh, except I changed pages too, I think. Now I've really
Just
messed
click
things
on
up.
it,
Click on the.
on the page itself.
Okay, but now I've lost the mouse. There we go. Okay, there we go.
We're trapped now, said Warren. When silent crumbled, they had it well and truly in the light. Well, said, where
Weintraub.
Weintraub hates me. We'll see what happens. I'm off home now. Wasn't all the time. As you know, I've never been one for medicines, but I must be the one medicine. What can save us now? Poison. Never, he said, raising his voice, never in all my life have I given anyone poison. You're a naive young lady, said Rosenthal. Epicurus thought that if his sufferings become unbearable, a wise man can kill himself out of love. Well, I love love no less than Epicurus. He rose to his full height, his hair, his face, his trembling fingers, his thin neck, everything that was dry and made colorless by time. Everything about him looked transparent, light, weightless. Only in his eyes was there something not subject to time, the power of thought.
Yeah, I think that's, so they're having a debate about suicide. But unless I'm getting the characters confused, it's Rosenthal who walks to the pit and is shot. So he decides not to commit suicide, whereas the doctor, I think, does commit suicide. It's an odd reversal because I wasn't keeping track of the names correctly when I read that passage. I was thinking it was the doctor who was advocating for suicide. Anyway, it's an interesting passage, and the doctor, I think I remember this correctly. I think the doctor and his wife do take what you might call the dignified exit of not marching to the pit. Rosenthal has a reason why he marches to the pit, why he goes with his people to go through that last minute. I think we can find that because it's roughly where we just were. Okay, so thoughts about the old teacher. Kind of what your own mental, emotional, literary reaction to the story is. Compare it a little bit to The Ravine. The Ravine is a very intense book too, isn't it? The killing pits, the shooting pits. Is this more intense? Is it a little bit more intense to put yourself in the fictional situation of people being marched to their death with no hope and no compassion, no pity from their killers?
It's like contradictorily different and the same. Like, it's the same type of like intensity in that these are events that are based on actual experiences that people have
Right.
gone through. And same with The Ravine, it's showing an actual event that occurred as there's a photograph of it. But of course, it's different in that this is fictional and that it may be exaggerated in comparison to The Ravine being an analysis of an actual event.
Right.
So they're both intense, but in different ways.
So yeah, okay. Isn't it the power of literature that it makes an effort to put you literally into the experience of the person who is in the novel or in the short story? So there's a difference between,
Observing a picture.
yeah, exactly. You're right on the right track. Sophie's Choice, is that a movie that some of you have seen? Sophie's Choice? Anybody ever hear of Sophie's Choice? So it's a mom who's being demanded, give me one of your children to be killed in the Holocaust. Sophie has to make the choice. And the only thing I remember of the movie, aside from what her choice, what choice she was presented with, is the picture, the image at a railroad station with her holding both children. So the image of the person undergoing a horrendous personal experience evokes pity, compassion, caring, concern on our part. But is it even more powerful when you've kind of lived through, fictionally, of course, a little bit of time with old Rosenthal, and you've been exposed to little Katya and her moment of kindness? Does it give you a different way of confronting the evil of the shooting pits, of understanding the terrible human reality of the shooting pits? It's a point that Timothy Snyder does make in his book. I'm not positive it's in the readings that you've done, but the difference between knowing some of the basic facts about the Holocaust or about the Holodomor and having a compassionate, visceral understanding or a feelingful representation of what these human beings have gone through, these human beings have gone through. And so I think the idea it's the reason why I wanted to spend a day on Grossman, is that his writings, both fictional and non-fictional, are really about the experience that the victims had, and helping to create in the reader some sense of understanding and compassion for that experience. Yeah, go ahead.
I think the
Hell of Treblinka, yeah.
I think that most like that story, reading it made me like tear up just from knowing that this isn't just like a fictional story. Like you can see the power and the old teacher and the relationship between the teacher and the child, but it does feel like a fictional story, and it still had me disconnected from possible events, but compared to the Hell of Treblinka, that was like, just the way that he wrote the experiences, and I'm sure the way that the experiences were described to him, just based on him acknowledging that, yes, it's hard to read these, and it's even harder, if not the same amount, to even write something about this.
Mhm.
I think, I related to, like, I understood what humanity in that sense was, more so with this, rather than just looking at the picture of the ravine.
Mhm.
And, it just shows the power in writing, more so than,
Yeah, but it's the power of the novelist or the short story writer to bring you along emotionally as well as cognitively. Yeah, go ahead.
I think the other thing that's really interesting too is like, with the other, like with the ravine, it's more about like what happened and how it happened. And this is, it's more about how the people handled it and what they decided was, you know, like even at the end you see his like last thoughts, like he wished he heard someone say something to him, you know, to comfort him. Or, you know, he was thinking about his last moments. That's more like interpersonal, but you give just statistics and numbers. And I think that's what definitely makes writing more efficient.
More effective.
Yeah, more effective in making you understand what happened.
Mhm.
Because you can relate to that more so than just, you know, 10,000 people died.
Right. So it evokes, so we're going to read Martha Nussbaum on the most basic moral emotion being compassion. And her view is that it's a human capacity that we all have the capacity for, but we haven't all exercised very deeply. And so sometimes we feel pity or compassion for another person, but sometimes we don't. Well, that's them. And her view is that almost all of morality comes into the question of compassion, or compassion comes into almost all of morality. I wanted to get to the last couple of passages in the Hell of Treblinka. I can get rid of Epicurus here. This is kind of a long essay, and there's a lot of factual material in it, but it's definitely worth reading. But here's one of the passages I wanted to, because this is like the emblem of our course. This should be put on the coat of arms for our course. Who would like to read this yellow highlighted passage? There you go. Can you see it well enough to read it? Well, then come forward. People who sit in the back are disadvantaged, and that doesn't seem right, so.
It is the writer's duty to tell the terrible truth, and it is the reader's civic duty to learn this truth. To turn away, to close one's eyes and walk past, is to insult the memory of those who have perished. Only those who have learned the whole truth can ever understand against what kind of monster our great and holy Red Army has entered into mortal combat.
Yeah. The last sentence, well, anybody have a reaction to that last sentence? It's the wrong last sentence. When you were reading it, what did you think? Did that last sentence really go with the first sentence? Why not?
Because the first sentence is talking about dealing with the horrors of history, and the second sentence is someone that we would consider a perpetrator of those horrors.
Yeah, there's that. Yes, that's fair. It's basically propaganda. That particular piece, that particular glorious, great and holy Red Army, that's written for the censors. That's not written for us, for our edification. What should the last sentence have been? There's a better last sentence for that paragraph, for that passage. So the first sentence, it is the writer's duty to tell the terrible truth, And it is the reader's civic duty to learn this truth. To turn away, to close one's eyes and walk past is to insult the memory of those who have perished. I use those two sentences as the last, it's almost the last two sentences in my book that you now have free copies of if you were smart, because that period is gone, that's history. If you didn't get a copy, I'll give you a copy of my own. The next sentence I find irritating because it's like the Home Office speaking, our great and glorious Red Army, which has done so many atrocious things. But what is a better end to that?
I saw this two sides of the same point, like he was trying to, I know that you might expect him to talk about, like, say something about the victims again, because he mentioned the victims as his last point, and then he would say something about the victims in his next sentence, but for him to flip to the army and then glorifying it and using language to glorify it is contradictory, but I think it's important that he includes it and that he wrote it in that way, because they were spreading propaganda of like the Red Army being, you know, the greatest, the best, but knowing that it's not actually that great army and that it's affecting these victims that were mentioned in the previous sentence, I think they do go together rather than them being seen as contradictory.
So
I think he's mocking like the great and holy.
I don't think he's mocking, but I think he's kowtowing. Either he's kowtowing or it was inserted, which is another possibility.
Oh, really?
It's inserted by the censor, you know, just like the watch was taken off the guy in the Reichstag. But I'm going to give you Abraham Lincoln talking about war. I think I'm going to give you Abraham Lincoln talking about war. This is Abraham Lincoln in his first inaugural 1861, when the Civil War has begun, but not yet. It's unclear, completely unclear that the Union will prevail. But what is perfectly clear is that the North and the South are in a murderous, deadly, protracted conflict war. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory, that's the most beautiful phrase. The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriotic grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. Do you see any reason why I'm connecting these two passages? I hadn't come in planning to quote Lincoln to you, but do you see a connection between this statement by one deeply humane leader, Abraham Lincoln, in response to a really profoundly humane statement by Grossman, which is kind of marred by his references to the Great Red Army? Is patriotism the problem? Or could he have put the reason why I thought of Lincoln is being patriotic. He's speaking of just conflict, and he's speaking also of reestablishing union among all of us as citizens. So there's kind of a lofty set of purposes that Lincoln is expressing here. I was looking for something kind of lofty from Grossman. So let's go back to Grossman. I had the gall to write a different ending to a Platonic dialogue. That's how bold I am. So I'll write a different ending to this line of Grossman. It is the writer's duty to tell the terrible truth, et cetera, et cetera. Only those who have learned the whole truth can ever understand how we can build for a future not grounded in hate. That's the way I would have finished the sentence. I invite you all to finish the sentence in a different way. How would you finish the sentence? How would you want to make that sentence really suit the occasion. Okay, pass. Who else wants to take a shot? Anybody else irritated by the end of the sentence, the Great Red Army? Is it just a question of maybe don't talk about the Great Red Army, but instead say we are engaged in a great civil war? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wouldn't have mentioned the Red Army, but I would have talked, like, you can definitely keep the last sentence as is without the Red Army, like, because he talks about going against a monster, and then you could just make it lofty and say it's evil, right? Like, what kind of monster everyone has to enter into mortal combat with? You know, talking about confronting evil, you know, as like a moral duty, and it's like life and death. That could be like.
That's really interesting, because it takes us back actually to the beekeeper who confronted evil in the most visceral way. He whacked him with a cudgel and killed him. He confronted evil. Grossman is kind of confronting evil in that way here. The great and noble, invincible Red Army will smash the Nazis. But in other places, including in other places in this essay, what he actually says is that humanity will prevail. I don't think I highlighted. I should have highlighted. Where is that humanity? Let's see if I can find humanity. Well, there are a ton of. So we'll just flip through and see if any of them.
We did highlight it. Is that the
Oh,
paragraph?
and this is in the Treblinka. Okay, great, good. That's what I was looking for. Who would like the privilege of reading these two paragraphs? It's turning out to be actually really cool. It's something you can put in your CV when you're.
Oh,
Okay, there you go. Good.
Great is the power of true humanity. Humanity does not die until man dies. And when we see a brief but terrifying period of history, a period during which beasts triumph over human beings, the man being killed by the beast retains to the last breath his strength of spirit, clarity of thought, and passionate love. And the beast that triumphantly kills the man remains a beast. This immortality of spiritual strength is a somber martyrdom, the triumph of a dying man over a living beast. It was this, during the darkest days of 1942, that brought about the beginning of reason's victory over bestial madness, the victory of good over evil, of light over darkness, of the forces of progress over the forces of reaction, a terrible dawn over a field of blood and tears, over an ocean of suffering, a dawn breaking amid the cries of dying mothers and infants, amid the death rattles of the aged. The beasts and the beast philosophy seemed to portend the sunset of Europe, the sunset of the world, but the red was not the red of the sunset, it was the red blood of humanity, a humanity that was dying yet achieving victory through its death. People remained people. They did not accept the morality and laws of fascism, they fought it in all the ways they could. They fought it by dying as human beings.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Good, thank you. In some kind of bizarre, I don't know, coincidence, this actually picks up almost each of the topics that we've talked about. It picks up the second sentence there. The person approaching death in a dignified way. The triumph of a dying man over a living beast. That sounds an awful lot like the old teacher walking for his own reasons. He could have chosen the morphine or whatever the drug was, but he chose to go with his people to face whatever the end was. So that's kind of picked up here. There's the recognition that fighting evil does involve violence. It involves conflict because evil is a powerful force. He is kind of saying that too. And I don't see how you could think otherwise. If you had observed the Nazis, but also had observed Stalin and Stalinism, you would seem to make sense that armed resistance to the Nazis is the only choice available. The beasts and the beast's philosophy seemed to portend the sunset of Europe, meaning the end of European civilization, the sunset of the world. But the red was not the red of a sunset. It was the red blood of humanity. It was human beings willing to shed their blood to end evil. A humanity that was dying, yet achieving victory through its death. People remained people. Isn't that a powerful sentence? The dehumanization which the Nazis undertook to impose on the Jews and the homosexuals and the Roma people and all of their victims, the handicapped people, they tried to dehumanize them, to take away their dignity and their humanity. And he is denying that that can be done. People remained people. They did not accept the morality and laws of fascism. They fought it in all the ways they could. They fought it by dying as human beings. That's powerful. It's really powerful. Is it break time? Yes, it is indeed break time. I think I can unplug. There we go. That's good. Yeah, okay.
So the Hunger Plan was a plan created by Nazi Germany. It was finalized on May 23rd, 1941. It was supposed to be the intentional starvation of the conquered Soviet people. So in total, about 30 million people were planned to be starved. That includes the destruction of all the land, industry, and cities in that area as well. This was opposed to the Soviets' unintentional starvation of Ukraine, at least in the beginning with collectivization of farms. The Nazis explicitly wanted to starve civilians to save food for themselves right from the start. The Soviet Union was considered the most realistic or ideal food source for Germany and its conquered states, especially Ukraine, because of its extremely fertile land and farms. It included the collectivization of all Soviet farms, which was inspired by Stalin's collectivization efforts. So Germany needed a source of food that could support not only its army, but also the population back in the homeland. So food from Ukraine and around the Soviet Union would be sent west to Germany and the rest of Europe to support them instead of supporting the people in the Soviet Union. This would also hopefully reverse all of Stalin's work in the Soviet Union and completely collapse it for German takeover and colonization. So their plan was for the Soviet Union to support them during the war in terms of food and stuff like that. And then eventually they were going to take over and colonize that land for themselves after everyone had been destroyed, basically. And as Snyder said here, it was to fight a war of destruction that would transform Eastern Europe into an exterminatory agrarian power. So again, the Hunger Plan was essentially to cause the extinction of industry as well as a great part of the population in the deficit regions. That's a quote directly from the plan. The original large-scale plan, remember, it was supposed to starve about 30 million people. It was much harder to implement than originally thought. It assumed that the collective farms would run better than they did for Stalin, which was not the case. And it didn't take into account that the Germans themselves didn't know the local land or agriculture and didn't have the same familiar imposing presence as the Soviet police and the party. At the very least, it failed to recognize the vast scale that was necessary, as every single farm present and harvest produced in the Soviet Union would have to be confiscated, including those crops that were hidden by farms and people And again, they didn't know the land as well as the Soviets did. So the wide-scale plan was never fully implemented, but again, in order to sustain the German forces and those in Germany without putting any of the costs on themselves, starvation was still widely used on Soviet citizens and prisoners of war. On September 16th, 1941, Göring orders all German troops to live off the land, or to essentially take what they need from the Soviets around them. The way that food was distributed, the order down the food was distributed was first to German soldiers, then to Germans in Germany, then to the Soviet people, and then to Soviet prisoners of war. Just as an example of how these policies affected cities and villages, about 20,000 civilian people in Kharkov and 50,000 people in Kiev starved to death because of this. And of course, there were many other cities and villages that were affected by this. This is just an example. So this here is a picture of dead bodies in a street in Kiev, and then there's a view of a Kharkov street. And Snyder makes this really interesting explanation of the mindset. He says, any food that entered the mouth of a Soviet citizen was taken from the mouth of a German child. So in total, about 3 million Soviet prisoners were taken to the gulags, stalags, and oflags by the end of 1941. The gulags were transit camps. The stalags were base camps for those enlisted and the non-commissioned officers. And then the oflags were camps for officers. Despite these huge numbers and the fact that the Nazis had expected more than this, actually, they did not prepare to provide the usual customary food, shelter, and medical services to these prisoners. So the Nazis had expected even more prisoners of war from the Soviet Union, but they did nothing to prepare to provide for them. Because of this, these camps were described as being designed to end life rather than preserve it, like a normal prisoner of war camp would have. Hitler wanted to instill fear into his own soldiers by treating the prisoners poorly. He thought if they treated the Soviets poorly, the Germans would think that the Soviets would do the same to them. So here are some examples of how the Soviet prisoners were treated. They were only counted, they were not named. In fact, Soviet prisoners of war were some of the first prisoners in Auschwitz and other camps that were tattooed with numbers. There were very little clinics or other medical care provided. Rarely they had access to toilets. There was no shelter. This includes the train ride or the death hike to the camps. They were exposed to the elements. And of course, there was little to no food. There was a 70% mortality rate during the marches and the train transports. Corpses would often fall out of the trains when they arrived. More than 1 million prisoners were also sent to Germany to work as laborers, and then some prisoners of war were used as test subjects for the Zyklon B gas at Auschwitz, which was eventually used to kill the Jews. This is an example of a camp. This is a camp in northern Germany. The camps were basically just barren land, and the prisoners dug these holes themselves for some form of shelter. Here's another example. That's another example of like a homemade hut, kind of in the ground. And then here's a camp that was in Poland. This one is in Germany. It's basically just an open field surrounded by barbed wire. So, as I mentioned before, Soviet prisoners of war were the last group of people to get food allocated to them out of what was taken by the Germans from the Soviet Union. Each prisoner was rationed about 2,040 to 2,200 calories a day, but received only about 700 to 1,500. Even though they were rationed this, they were never guaranteed food and they were never fed regularly. Usually only the strongest prisoners or the ones that had been made guards got food. It also depended on if they could work or not. If they couldn't work, they more than often just were not fed. In addition to this, the food that they were fed was not of the best quality. Bread was usually made out of wood flour, which was essentially just sawdust, so it wasn't flour at all. And then thin beet soup, stuff like that just really lacked nutritional value, and even though they were fed, it wasn't really doing anything for them. So because of this, many prisoners ate grass, dirt, leaves, pine needles, bark. They were told to graze like cattle. There were often corpses strewn all over the ground, which were unfortunately consumed because of the starvation. This cannibalism, too, was often seen by commanders of these camps to only support the view that the Soviet people were like beasts or unhuman, which was one of the reasons why the hunger plan was implemented in the first place. So, like, seemed to be okay to do so in the German times, of course. And then a particular piece of data that I thought was really, really horrifying was as many Soviet prisoners of war died on a single given day in autumn 1941 as did British and American prisoners of war over the course of the entire Second World War. And then here I was able to find a few firsthand accounts of people that survived or had seen things in these camps. Ivan Shalinsky survived both the starvation of the Holodomor and the prisoner of war camps. He sang traditional Ukrainian songs to cheer himself up in the camp. One of them had the lyrics, "If I only had wings, I would lift myself to the sky, to the clouds, where there is no pain and no punishment." Rudolf Hess,
Yes.
Hess? Okay. He was the commandant of Auschwitz. He recalled prisoners dying while trying to swallow turnips or potatoes. He said they tried to force it down their throats, or they just simply quietly found a place to die. And then this last one came from a book that compiled accounts from people who were children at the time of the war. Yura Karpovich, who was 8, recalls how she saw how they drove our prisoners of war through our village in long columns, in torn and burned greatcoats. Where they stayed overnight, the bark was gnawed off the trees. Instead of food, they threw them a dead horse. The men tore it to pieces. In all, about 50,000 Soviet prisoners of war were shot by the Germans, and 2.6 million Soviet prisoners of war starved or died due to mistreatment. So 3.1 million Soviet prisoners of war in total died at the hands of the Germans. Snyder, specifically in Goldlands, mentions how some Ukrainian citizens tried to help these prisoners of war. For example, women identified men as relatives in order to arrange for their release. Women married prisoners completing labor tasks outside the camps. When it was allowed, sometimes the Nazis realized that they would still be working for Germans anyway, either in the camps or outside, so they would let it happen. In Kremenchuk, which is a city in Ukraine, camp laborers would leave empty bags in the city in the morning and then pick them up later, full of food left by people that passed by. And then women often tried feeding prisoners in death marches and in the camps by giving them food, but they were often driven away by guards or even sometimes killed for doing so. And this is a photo of some prisoners of war receiving rations in a camp in Poland, just out of Israel. Yeah. So, in conclusion, this treatment of the Soviet prisoners of war is largely forgotten today, for a few different reasons. Stalin presented these prisoners of war as deserters and abandoned them. He often had their family members arrested as punishment, actually. I believe in Bloodlands, Snyder mentions that when Stalin's own son was captured, he had his own daughter-in-law arrested as punishment, which I thought was kind of crazy. In addition to that, the victims of starvation in the cities and villages and in the prisoner of war camps were of a wide range of nationalities from all across the Soviet Union. So there is no one coherent group to fight for them and represent them. Even so, as more information comes to light and we recognize the scope of this crime against Soviet citizens and prisoners of war, it is important to remember the victims, their families, and those that tried to help. And then this is a photo of some survivors of a prisoner of war camp in Poland after the camp had just been liberated. So they're able to.
Wow,
It's really-
it's a pretty tough piece of research,
Yeah,
very thorough. So reactions and questions?
it's okay if you don't have questions.
Where did you find the first person or the memoir type information?
Some of it was in Bloodlands.
Okay.
Some of it was just through like Googling stuff,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah.
I found an excerpt of the book that I mentioned on a website, and it had some of those
Great,
things. So,
yeah.
It was interesting.
It's one of the good things about online research is that there's a lot of material that isn't published in books that is collected archivally, that you can get access to. So, what an atrocity. I think we learned when we talked about the Holodomor about the special horror of death by starvation, the horrible way of dying in that way. This is well, I think you said 2.6 million prisoners
Yeah.
died of starvation, another 500,000 were killed by bullets. Just horrifying. And I'm glad you brought up the hunger plan. There was a different term for it. Was it the purple notebook or the green notebook?
The green folder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Confronting evil. What you're talking about is evil. It's not accidental. It's not, well, it happened, but it's in the past. It's just flat out evil. So I'll share just a little personal history. My wife is French from the region of Alsace, which is eastern France and the Germany border across the Rhine River from Germany. And Germany immediately occupied Alsace after it defeated France, and it conscripted the teenage boys who were still in Alsace and forced them into the German army. And many of those boys wound up in Soviet prison camps, prisoner of war camps, with conditions just like that. The Soviet Union held something like 50 to 100,000 Alsatian young men in camps. They were really death camps. Her uncle died there. Great. Aspirin or something when people do a really tough presentation, they need a little,
It was
little
hard to
booster.
research.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. You did a really nice job. Okie doke.
Send it.
You did, yeah.
Through there. I could
Uh,
probably just pull up my email.
if you
and
can-
click the link through there.
If you can find it, that's easier.
Yeah.
Because I don't have email. I don't access it through this machine. What I could do though, if you have trouble accessing it, I can put it into files or anything. Yeah, well, you uploaded it though, didn't you, to the, you told me that you uploaded it to the assignment.
I don't think I haven't uploaded it to the assignments yet. I think I've just sent it through the email
Okay.
so far. But I think I can just pull up like my sent email. And you should just-
Okay. Yeah, it's right here. Oh, it's just a link.
Yeah, it's a link and it brings it straight.
So are you able to just pull up the link on the
Yeah, I
browser?
think so.
Yeah. It's kind of a complicated link, so it's hard to pass it back to you, but
Oh, I get that. Hold on.
two-factor. Can't live without it.
Do I have one already? It's always there's like a link.
There is, yeah. I had a bad piece of skin removed, but it's getting better. Thank you. It's up high enough that most people can't see it.
No, you were turned around and I was like, oh my gosh. Glad.
It had a huge pressure bandage on it, so it looked like I had a funny little hat on my head.
Oh, I don't want to have it. Oh, I really don't.
There you go.
Now it should
Perfect.
work. All right.
Perfect.
Okay. All right, so my presentation is on the Daimler-Benz company, which is like known today as the Mercedes-Benz car brand. And so I'm talking about their involvement during World War II. Specifically, its ties with the Nazi Party and basically how they were able to continue their brand and become as successful as they are today. So we'll begin by just briefly going over the origins of the company and its founders. So on the left here is Carl Benz, who is a famous automobile engineer from Germany. And he's most widely known for building the first gasoline-powered car. And on December 31st, 1878, was when Benz fully completed his design of a two-stroke engine. And he was granted a patent for his work in the following year. And in 1883, he and a few other colleagues founded a company called Benz and Company, basically, and where he continued to pursue his work to create a horseless carriage. Then by 1885, he finished his design of a two-seat vehicle, which I can show you on the next slide, which he named the Benz Patent Motor Wagon. And it was shortly after this when he would become accredited for creating the first automobile fueled by gas. However, at the same time, two other men by the name of Daimler and Maybach, which you can see over on the right, we're working on a very similar project. So these are both their designs. On the left is Benz, and on the right is Daimler.
So when was the first Ford? When was Henry Ford's first vehicle? Maybe some of you know. It was 19 something, wasn't it? Just an interesting.
I don't
This is
know.
very early. it
Yeah,
seems
this
like.
is very early. So the one on the left is supposedly like the first ever design, and it's a
1903.
Oh, 03?
1903.
Mhm.
Daimler and Maybach produced a smaller and lighter and more powerful engine than the one Benz had built. And in the same year, the Benz patent motor wagon was showcased. The Daimler introduced the first four-wheel automobile, as you can see here. And so soon after, Daimler's company, which is it's called DMG, would become the leading competitors in the automotive industry in Germany.
Henry Ford was 26.
He thought the first the first vehicle was 03.
In 03, and he was 26 when this was made.
Oh, I see, yeah, I get it.
So after the release of their inventions, both companies quickly made efforts to market themselves internationally and began creating newer models of their vehicles. Daimler was successful in making connections with several foreign nations. He was able to obtain license agreements in France and Britain, and had also made business ties in the US and Canada. Benz, however, struggled for a bit in forging foreign contacts, and he would eventually find success in the US and South Africa, but long after the DMG company did. So as Benz was still trying to make these connections, Daimler was attempting to push the limits of his creation. So from the beginning, motorsport was looked at as a way of popularizing and showing the capabilities of the automobile. And so one of the sales agents for DMG, the name's up there, I cannot pronounce it, but he wanted a newer and faster version of the car. So in 1901, DMG created a racing car that was commissioned by him, and he went on to name this car after his teenage daughter, Mercedes, and the car ended up receiving high scores and was praised for its accomplishment. So by 1902, the company had the brand name Mercedes patented, and soon all the race cars and high-performing vehicles would use the Mercedes engine, and then all those cars would go on to be known as Mercedes. So this right here is the logo that they had. So prior to World War I, both companies also created engines used in aviation. Although this is this only made up a very small percentage of their sales at the time, it was still promoted heavily by the companies. So in 1909, DMG introduced their famous Mercedes three-pointed star logo, which is stated to represent mobility on land, on water, and in air. So once the First World War broke out, the company shifted their focus of their production to the needs of war, specifically by creating engines for aircrafts. So both DMG and Benz soon became the biggest aero engine manufacturers in Germany at the time. So after the First World War, both companies began to struggle immensely. The German economy was plummeting. There was a shortage of petroleum. Foreign producers like Ford Motor Company penetrated the market, and on top of that, because the automobile was still considered to be a luxury product, it had a 15% extra tax. So in an effort to save their company, Carl Benz reached out to DMG to propose a merger of the companies, but it was denied at first. But then by 1924, the economic crisis had only worsened, and that's when the two companies decided to sign an agreement of mutual interest, stating that they would combine their expertise while maintaining their legal independence. This would be the beginning of the rise of the Mercedes-Benz brand, and by 1926, the companies worked together to overcome the new difficulties within the industry. They were forced to make cutbacks and had limited themselves to only making 4 basic models in the medium size and luxury car segments. However, by the early 1930s, Daimler-Benz produced the first 6-cylinder diesel truck, which you can see right there, which would eventually lead to their major breakthrough for their business. So it was around 1932 when the German automotive industry was really starting to grow again, but it was also around this time that Hitler rose to power, and Hitler himself became captured by the company for multiple reasons. For starters, he loved the idea that it was a German-based company, and it was known to be a luxury product, so it would make sense that he and his fellow high-class leaders wanted to be seen in such vehicles, and he ended up having many of these custom made from him by the company. In 1939, another reason he grew fond of the company was that he saw its potential to convey his idea of superiority in engineering. So during this time, Germany was way behind the US in terms of motorization, and he made a promise to the German people that he was going to develop the auto industry. So with the help of the government, Mercedes-Benz began producing almost 4 times as many cars as they were producing within 3 years. And, the factory also sought out to help out Volkswagen, which, together they built 30, prototypes. And, they were supposed to be mass produced as the people's car, but because, however, Volkswagen quickly turned into a military vehicle during World War II. So there ended up being tens of thousands of people who paid for those cars but never got them. And which leads me to my next point, that Hitler also recognized early on how important mobilization was going to be for war in the future. So that was another reason why there's a big emphasis on the automotive industry. And starting from 1937, the company's focus shifted to supplying vehicles from military use once again, and as well as building these large-scale engines. Truck production, like I mentioned earlier, quickly became the largest corporate division, while passenger car production virtually stopped altogether by 1942. So by then, the company was basically solely producing for the German Army, Air Force, and Navy. And obviously, an increase in demand for the military vehicles called for more workers to produce them. However, there was a major shortage of workers because so many of them were fighting in the war already. So the company began to employ women to try and keep up with the high demand of products, but there still wasn't enough people. So that's when they turned to forced labor. So this included prisoners of war, abducted civilians, and of course, prisoners from concentration camps that were located close to the plants. So depending on where the forced laborers came from, depended on how they were treated. For example, if you were a forced laborer from Western Europe, you were put in hostels, private quarters, or schools. If you were from Eastern Europe, or just a prisoner of war, you were placed in barrack camps. And if you were from the concentration camps, you were guarded and just put in degrading and inhumane conditions. So these individuals were loaned to the companies for a fee, and by 1944, almost half of the Daimler-Benz employees, and I've seen like different numbers, so between like 30,000 and 45,000 of their employees were forced to work for the company. After the war, under the Potsdam Agreement, all German assets abroad were confiscated and used for payment of reparations. So Daimler-Benz lost all foreign subsidiaries, affiliates, and branches. They had built themselves a large international network during the interwar period, which was then dismantled by the Allied partnership. And after 1945, they found their company to be in the same place, basically, that it had been 20 years before at the end of World War II. The company reduced down to 4 of its original plants. However, at the same time, Daimler-Benz was needed during the economic reconstruction of the company. So it quickly gained success again and has only grown and expanded ever since. So it wasn't until like long after the war that once they had rebuilt the company that Daimler-Benz finally admitted its ties to the Nazi party, or at least to an extent. The first step in the company's plan to revive, it was the first step in their company's plan to revive their image. So up until this point, the focus had been on rebuilding the company primarily from a financial standpoint, but had yet to address how not only they put thousands of people through terrible conditions, but basically pretty much promoted and sponsored Hitler's initiatives through their products. So the company started working with an initiative that it's a foundation that demanded humanitarian compensation for former forced laborers. And according to an article that I found, in 1988, they had accumulated $11.7 million to pay back victims, stating that they, and this is a quote, hope to make a contribution toward preventing the horrors of the past from being reiterated, and that with this gesture, they hope to soothe the still painful scars of the Nazi regime. And this was said by the company's board chairman at the time, which I just thought was an interesting way of putting it, because it kind of just sounded like a way of buying off an apology and not actually taking accountability. And I think I should also mention that there were like very few documents and books actually about this from what I looked at. And a lot of the information came from like the Mercedes-Benz group themselves. And in it, they do address that they had forced laborers working for the company at the time, but obviously they don't really say much more than that. So in a way, it kind of felt like they were trying to address that it happened, but again, not really taking accountability and still trying to sweep that part of their history under the rug. So you can see that the company itself is still trying to control their narrative of what happened and still don't really want any other consumers to know. I think that's it. That's what I said.
Okay, good. Questions? Let's take a look at what you got there. So the company
Wow.
website,
Yeah, a lot of it comes from the company website. Yeah.
I just would say like, I hadn't even considered like what the company was doing,
Mhm.
like during the, like when it was made and like just putting into perspective, seeing like, oh yeah, this is all happening in Germany during that time.
Mhm.
And then seeing that there's not that much known to the general public about like the company itself too.
Mhm.
It's just amazing how much of their image has been wiped out from something like that and has been like rebranded, and I don't even know how.
Well, that's what I thought too, because as I was like researching this and I found it out, I was like, how do you rebuild yourself from it? And
Yeah.
it really like, I think it's just a matter of them kind of just covering everything, because you really can't find, from what I found, like all of that information came from them. So,
That's what's like most
Yeah.
astonishing to me, like to know that they were just heavily contributing to the war on Germany's end, and then at the same time, they're like, you would never even make that connection, at least as an American, I just didn't even think about it until the presentation.
Mhm.
Yeah, like, oh yeah, this company is involved during
Yeah.
that time, yeah.
Mhm.
I think that's just most interesting.
did you learn anything about the corporate directors from, let's say, 1938 through the war?
a little bit. Again, it still didn't have too much on them. I know some of it said a lot of them were like taken off the board for a bit. I saw some of that, but not too much on it that I could find.
Because this question of corporate responsibility and collaboration with the Nazis,
Mhm.
not all German corporations were eager to collaborate with the Nazis. But I kind of think that Daimler-Benz was a willing collaborator, a
Yeah.
willing
From
participant.
what it seemed like, yeah.
There is a book. I was just trying to find
I
that.
did see it and I did try and I've been trying to get it, but I cannot find anywhere that had it. Everywhere was out of stock. And that was like the one piece of like information that actually seemed like it went in depth on it. Otherwise, it was like nothing else.
So there are there are a lot of questions about corporate accountability. We're going to have a session, a week on corporate accountability and the corporate doing of evil. And who do you hold responsible? Do you hold, can you see the glass house through the window there? Can anybody see the glass house from your perspective? I can't see it from here. It's Ford Motor headquarters. Ford had a subsidiary, Ford Werke, in Germany. And Ford Werke used extensive forced labor. You said 50% of Mercedes or Daimler-Benz.
Yeah.
But it was maybe 35% of Ford Werke's labor force was forced labor, including workers, prisoners from Auschwitz. So horrible complicity. But it turns out in 1998, and again, I wonder if this came up in your reading, but there were lawsuits filed by basically Ukrainian citizens, now kind of elderly, who had been forced to work for Ford and GM Opel, who sued GM and Ford in United States courts for reparations. And that compelled a whole bunch of disclosure from archives from Ford Motor Company and also from General Motors. I don't know if there are suits also in Germany about Mercedes.
Not from what I could find, because I looked it up too, because I
Mhm.
thought there's no way that there couldn't be, but from what I researched.
Well, the interesting thing about Ford Motor Company was I went into this assuming that Ford Motor Company had a lot of culpability during the war. And what these investigations in 1998 showed was that Ford Motor Company had completely lost control of Ford Verka. The Nazi Party, the Nazi government seized Ford Verka and cut the glass house out of all corporate ownership and even corporate knowledge. So those investigations, which I think were credible investigations in 1998, exonerated international ownership of Ford Motor Company, though Ford Verka was unbelievably guilty of forced labor. Sounds like Daimler-Benz
Yeah.
also unbelievably guilty. You made the point, actually it was in the previous presentation, the diet 700 to 1500 calories. A man can survive for a long time on 1500 calories. A man will die in 2 or 3 months on 700 calories. So that's an important range. And the diet that was given to East European forced workers, you mentioned that there was an inequality of treatment. So Dutch workers and French workers were treated differently from Ukrainian, the people from the East, Ost-Verka, the East workers. But their diet was provided in these in the evidence gathering during the Ford trial. And I used MyFitnessPal to work out the number of calories, and it was 600 or 700 calories a day that was being provided. It was a starvation diet that was provided to the East workers in both of those auto factories and truck factories. Yeah, good.
I was gonna say, I think it's interesting because I would expect like a company that has such strong ties to Hitler and the Nazi Party and that sort of thing, to just kind of like not be able to exist post World War II. But like this company is doing incredibly well in America. Like it's still considered a luxury vehicle. So it's it's odd. Like she was saying, I didn't even really know that they had ties to the Nazi Party.
Yeah, good.
Did you ever find any, like, or did you ever like see anything about, like, I know it was mainly on Mercedes-Benz, but like, did you ever see anything about how Ford is like, you know, actual company here, like how like Ford, or Henry Ford, I should say, him and his family are kind of associated with the Nazi Party?
I saw a little bit of it. There definitely were articles. It was like allegations against Ford. What was the other one? It was Ford.
Ford, Opel, General Motors.
And yeah, GM was the other one. Can't remember, but I know BMW was just another company.
Peugeot in France, I think, was aligned
Yeah,
with the Nazi government.
but those were the only ones that happened.
There was a second set of war crimes trials, Nuremberg trials. I was trying to find those also, of companies. And it was just a small number of companies. I don't think that Daimler was one of the companies that was tried, but Farben, anybody know who Farben is? IG Farben? So they were a massive chemical, multinational, multi-industry company, which A, used a vast number of slave laborers, and B, produced Xylon B gas, which was tested on the prisoners of war that you mentioned, and which killed over 1 million Jews. So IG Farben executives were tried, the company was tried, and executives of 2 other companies. If I can find it, when we talk about it in a couple of weeks, I think it'll probably be in the readings. But it's an important question. How do you assign corporate responsibility? Simply building, could you go back to some of those truck pictures that you have? Those are more modern.
This one?
That one, by the way, is that literally an historical picture, the upper right corner?
Upper right, that was a Volkswagen, I believe, one of the ones that they helped
So
produce.
it
for
looks like a Hummer.
Yeah.
Doesn't that look like a modern vehicle?
Yeah.
But you're saying it was from the 1940, 41, 42 period. That is simply amazing, isn't it? Is that a gun on the front? What is it? That stick-like thing on the front? Can you tell what it is?
Probably a gun like this guy.
Well, you can't aim it, that's the thing.
Paddle of some sort, or shovel.
think it's where you found the gun.
It looks like a shovel.
It looks like I just can't tell. It does look like a gun though. It's aimed forward, but there's nowhere for a gun in this thing. So I don't know. It doesn't really make
The
a lot of sense.
other, the bigger truck.
You think it's a shovel?
Might be a shovel right there.
Oh, yeah, that one.
It's got like that white band on the side,
The other
that
one.
might be holding it down.
Yeah, okay. So you got your Hummer stock and you need a shovel. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So the truck before this one?
Yeah, so that also looks like a fairly modern.
Yeah, yeah, this was the ones that they started producing. I think this one might have been before. I think they said. No, it wasn't World War, it was World War. Or maybe it was World War One.
I think it's World War II, but maybe pre-war, might be.
It was
1936,
pre-war when they
38.
started when the trucks started
Right.
really coming out.
But the thing is,
Still-
would you call a corporation which was building aircraft and army trucks a war criminal for that reason? I think international law would not call them, if they were it's a German company, it's making trucks and aircraft and so forth.
Not for making trucks, no, but for including workers.
But forced labor
Yeah.
is a crime. That's an internationally recognized crime. It's a crime against humanity. Likewise, making the apparatus of genocide was considered to be a crime. You were going to say.
I would say technically, if that was true, then some of the companies here would be
Yeah,
for the Middle East
Right.
and for Vietnam.
Right.
Because technically they were pretty war crimes.
and
Some states or some
the
parts.
reality is that companies really don't have a huge amount of choice. If they're located, don't have choice in terms of going ahead and making trucks, which wind up also having military application. They do have a choice about making Xylon B, and they should
Bayer is
be
part of
deterred.
that.
Go ahead.
Bayer is probably, like, Bayer was the company that I saw was most well known to me, at least part of that merger of companies they mentioned.
So Farben
Yeah.
and Bayer, that is interesting. So do you think that Bayer is part of Farben?
Yeah, they said that, what I saw was that IG Farben is a merge of a few different companies, and Bayer is one of them. And
So
part
your
of that
baby
merger.
aspirin was made by a company that also made Xylon B, originally a pesticide and eventually a mass killing gas.
Yeah.
In a couple of weeks, we're going to have a really interesting conversation about corporate accountability, corporate responsibility, and corporate decision making. It raises a lot of those same questions that we talked about several weeks ago about why do people participate and why do they voluntarily do evil things? Aryanization was a policy which German companies sometimes cooperated with and sometimes didn't. Some companies refused to fire the Jewish employees, and other companies went along with it. And there, I think you could make a strong case that went on the side of crime against humanity, not just normal business practice. I don't know about Daimler-Benz. It would be an interesting question to know whether they committed the crime or the atrocity of Aryanization, meaning firing their Jewish accountants, Jewish engineers, Jewish staff. Okay, are there any other questions or observations people would like to make? It's pretty interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
This is probably less a question for you, more just a general question, but I'm wondering if there are any other German companies that are still like around, like doing well today, like, I don't know. So like, it's really unsettling, the fact, because again, like I had no idea that we had such strong ties with the it's just, yeah, I'm wondering if there's any other companies that are successful.
So you probably know that Werner von Braun, the American space scientist, rocket scientist, was a Nazi scientist. He was one of the chief designers of the V1, V2 rockets. And he was part of the scientific group that American intelligence gathered up and made an offer. They didn't kidnap him, but they basically said, you can live very comfortably in America if you come and work for us. There was something called Operation Paperclip, which was, it's a funny name, for a pretty unsavory activity, but it was an effort literally to identify scientists in the Third Reich who could be recruited to American companies and to American scientific research practice, including companies. So it's not exactly answering the question, but it's kind of a residual follow-on. Really, really interesting. There was a one of the professors I had in college was he was Austrian. His name was Heinz von Forster. He was an engineering professor. And he was one of the creators of the cybernetics movement. I don't know if you've ever heard of that in software. Cybernetics. It was kind of like AI before its time. Heinz von Forster was in that group of people. And I graduated from college in 1971, and at the 50th anniversary of my graduation, they were doing some kind of retrospective. They asked for stories of faculty. So I said, well, I have a story about Heinz von Forster. I was in his office in 1968 with screaming protesters outside the window, and Heinz von Forster, Austrian, a working scientist in the Nazi regime in Berlin in 1942, 43, 44. In 1968, he produced out of his desk a megaphone and a go bag. You know what a go bag is? A go bag? It's very important to have one in these troubled times. Passport, a bunch of money, and 3 packs of cigarettes if you have to be a smoker. So you're all ready to go. And what he said was, I have been in a fascist dictatorship in my life. I will never be in one again. The megaphone is so I can protest. But if that fails, my go bag is my next. But anyway, the interesting thought that I had as an adult, I took all of this at face value. As an adult, I came to wonder, how did Heinz von Forster wind up in the United States? Was he one of those paperclip guys? Was he recruited by the CIA or whatever the transitional OSS, I think was the Transitional Intelligence Service? Is there a secret about Heinz von Forster? And I did try to figure it out, but I couldn't. I just didn't have the clearance, I'm sorry to say, but couldn't get the real story. He seemed like a decent guy, but
You have the clearance, that probably tells you what happened.
maybe so. It's all pretty interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the most ironic parts about this part of history with like scientists, most of the scientists who work on the atomic bomb were taken from Germany and like surrounding countries. They mostly came over because like for the I did a project on it with the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
That was mainly comprised of European and American.
Except they weren't Nazi scientists. They were Italian, they were refugees and Jewish scientists.
And there were some Germans too. It was very ironic because they're the ones that kind of put the end to it.
So Klaus Fuchs, who was one of the really famous spies, he was German, but he was a Soviet spy in England. And he gave the plans of the first atomic bomb in the Soviet Union. So he's not a good example. I thought I was going to illustrate your point, but there was a huge influx right before the war of intellectuals and scientists in the United States who were basically, they were refugees from fascism and Nazism, including the most brilliant. Who's the Italian physicist?
I thought it was
Einstein.
No, Einstein is Austrian.
Oh yeah, he's Austrian.
But he
And-
also
He lived in Germany for a while.
Yeah.
And he went to school there.
But he gave the US a good deal before the rise, no, maybe around the time of the rise
I
of
thought it
Hitler.
was like,
No, I'm thinking of you're online, Italian physicist, University of Chicago, atomic bomb.
Oh, I know what you're talking about, yeah.
Did someone offer a theory? Who did you
Was
say?
it Oppenheimer?
No, not Fermi. Yeah, Fermi actually, like Fermi lab.
Yeah.
Right. So Fermi was an Italian physicist who emigrated to the United States away from Mussolini. So in other words, the United States really benefited before the war from scientists who were fleeing oppression. Is that what you found too? Did you come up with Fermi? Enrico Fermi, I believe his name was. Very smart. He and his team developed the first, what do you call it, self-sustaining nuclear pile
Nuclear reactor.
in a handball court at the University of Chicago. Neutrons everywhere. So what are the takeaways here? There are two big takeaways that are really interesting for us. So thank you. You're done. You're off the spot. Your moment of terror and fun is over.
Thank you.
But thank you. You did a nice job. In each of these instances, we're talking about something in common. We're talking about a huge organization. It's the German army, which took millions of prisoners of war and then organized them to die. So a huge organization of death. And then the Daimler Corporation is also an organization. It's a point that I think is worth our kind of underlining. We're going to talk about it again in a couple of weeks. But it's the fact that great evil mostly can't happen spontaneously. It can't happen just as a kind of pogrom, an expression of anti-Muslim feeling or anti-Christian feeling. And in China, actually, at various times there's been violence against Christians in China, or against Jews in Russia, Germany. We have a former in-law grandfather. I think I've got that right. Shouldn't there be one word in English for a former deceased grandfather on my ex-wife's side? There should be one word for that, don't you think? Family
Your
relationship.
late grandfather, your late ex-grandfather-in-law.
Yeah, but you've left out a few parts. I forget which parts. But anyway, he was the child of Russian Jews around, he was probably born about 1895. He was an elderly fellow. And he spoke of emigrating to the United States in like 1910 or so, ahead of the pogroms in Russia. The pogroms were, beating up and killing rural Jewish people, of whom he was one. And the ones who didn't get killed were getting conscripted into the Russian army for 15 or 20-year terms of service. So instead of confronting pogroms and conscription into a horrible, brutal army, he emigrated to Boston. But it's kind of, I've told you several stories from different parts of my life. The uncle of my current wife, who died of starvation in a Soviet prisoner of war camp, horrible tragedy in that family, and horrible tragedy in the village, because all of the teenagers of that village were taken in 1942. So almost none of them came back. They were sent as cannon fodder to Stalingrad. They were eventually captured by the Red Army, and they were sent off to a notorious prison camp in Russia. And who said? Someone said, well, I didn't know anything about that. It's just a few minutes ago, I didn't know Daimler was a part of. Most of us don't have any idea at all of the many smaller tragedies that occurred as a result of World War II, and yet they were all evil. Stalin could have released the French prisoners overnight. There was no reason for him to retain French prisoners who had been coerced into the German army.
And that point reminds me of, before forgetting, in the reading, like the way Grossman described, every part of the prisoners was
valuable to them except for their lives.
Mhm.
And I think that like is what that reminds me of, that even their hairs on their body was used
Mhm.
by the Germans rather than, and valued more than the actual lives of the
Yeah, yeah.
just-
You know, that was one of the things which was really emotionally powerful for me in visiting Auschwitz, was whole vast quantities of hair. And then another place, whole vast quantities of children's shoes. Children's shoes. Where are those children? Those children were all killed. They're all dead. They're all gone. So the human reality, so actually we touched on the human reality, it's with the Grossman, and then the kind of corporate manifestation of evil action and evil intention. Once in a while, I have a doubt between one Tuesday and the next, whether this is getting to you, whether it's capturing your moral imagination. That's my hope, that it's capturing your moral imagination. You're coming to realize this is something I can actually really care about. I can care about it as a historical fact, but also the fact that we live in a world that is very capable of evil in the future. And or maybe I can be part of the story that Grossman endorses. Human beings can change evil, can defeat evil. Sometimes it's an ugly image. I realize the cudgel on the head of the Nazi about to shoot you, but that's not his central message. I think his central message is humanity and human beings can persist and can defeat evil through their kindness and through their compassion for each other. How powerful that is.